the Center for the Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy, the SRC, and the International Office here at Nelson Mandela University as we celebrate our Diversity Month and our Women's Month celebrations. So we welcome you and we thank you that you are able to join us, whether you're in our Zoom session or if you're joining us from the CANRAD's YouTube channel. We also welcome you to engage with us and share your comments and contributions and engage with us via the chat sections of both platforms, and we'll bring that into the conversation later. All right, just before we start officially with the engagement, I'd like to call to the platform to give the official and institutional welcome, the President of the SRC, Mr. Poncho Tongwane, to the platform. Poncho?
Thank you very much, Spogas. Of course, it gives me, a great pleasure to be the first one to speak today, of course. But let me begin by greeting, all the participants, the university management, of course, our Vice Chancellor, Professor Motwa, of course, the Dean of Students, and all the participants and the speakers who are currently with us today. Of course, as we are here convened in an institution of higher learning, attempting to answer a difficult question confronting our society, it's a pity that we are convened here on an online platform, because of the unprecedented times of the global pandemic. Let me extend my gratitude for the opportunity given to me by our collaboration with the International Office and CANRAD. This afternoon, we are invited to think very deep with one of the finest brain in our country in an attempt to analyze the society from an international perspective in order to better understand our position in a global space, continentally and nationally, so that we are well equipped to expose the contradiction and locate our standing in society insofar as the primary contradiction is concerned, meaning the fundamental problem of the 21st century, which is the color line. The relations between the two different groups of people, namely the Black population and the white population, with the former in perpetual state of asking while the latter is enjoying the benefits to come with life. As Fanon would say that, we are rich because we are Black, and of course, we are rich because we are white, I meant to say, and you are poor because you are Black. I'm not the main speaker. Dr. Mpofu will be assisting us to answer whether South Africa has really vanquished apartheid or not. As he argued deeply in his new book, that apartheid did not die, it was privatized. In 1948, the pro-Afrikaner National Party, which was called NP, came to power with the ideology of apartheid, a rigorous and authoritarian approach than the previous segregation policies that was governing our country prior to 1948. While white supremacy was cementing its power, Black opposition politics were evolving. I attempt to argue that the damage of apartheid is so huge that it cannot be abolished through a dialogue willingly. However, my argument should not be construed as a slap on our struggle icons. 20 years into democracy, Black people are still living in squalor on the outskirts of South Africa. It's still evident in South Africa who afford the ever-changing price of bread. The architectures of apartheid still control the means of production, which ultimately means controlling our lives. They determine where you work, where you live, how you live your life, and where you study. As we have seen in the country, in 2015, the student was saying that enough, it's enough. We are unable to afford the fees. It requires an intellectual, rigor and bravery to have an honest conversation to get a clearer perspective about the current state of Blackness, which is in shambles, in order to find a better solution. Here at Nelson Mandela University, we always grab intellectual engagement opportunities with warm hands as part of our commitment to generate cutting-edge knowledge for the sustainable future. I'm looking forward to learn from Dr. Mpofu, and I have no doubt that you will assist us to answer the question of whether South Africa has really vanquished apartheid or not. Thank you very much, and all of you, you're welcome. We're looking forward to have a proper engagement with you. Thank you very much, Spogas.
Thank you so much, Poncho. And also just for giving context into arguably some of the conversation that's going to come into the discussion today. I'm going to get straight into introducing and welcoming our main speaker, Dr. Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh, who's of course not a stranger to the Nelson Mandela community. We've had Dr. Mpofu-Walsh in 2017 launching his first book, Democracy and Delusion. Just a brief bio of Dr. Mpofu-Walsh. Dr. Mpofu-Walsh is an author, recording artist, and scholar. He was the president of the UCT SRC in 2010. He holds a PhD in international relations from Oxford. His debut book, Democracy and Delusion, won the City Press Tafelberg Non-Fiction Award and was longlisted for the Sunday Times Ellen Patton Nonfiction Award. In this book that we're launching today, Mpofu-Walsh unpacks the complexities and the existence of apartheid in today's post-democratic South Africa. This argument is spread across 5 themes: space, law, wealth, punishment, and technology. Without any further ado, Dr. Mpofu-Walsh.
Well, thanks so much, Spogazi, and thank you all very much for being here today. I'd like to particularly thank Datu Sonwabo Sturman, who has now for the second time invited me to launch one of my books here with the Nelson Mandela University community. To him, particular gratitude. Thank you so much, Data, for honoring my work in the way that you have over the last 4 years. And I was really hoping that I would be able to speak at NMU. And so I'm very glad that you were able to make that happen, along also with Pedro Mzileni, who I know will be my respondent today, to thank him in advance for giving of his time and also promoting this work within the NMU community for critical engagement. And also to Poncho, SRC president, having been in that position once a long time ago myself, I know the burdens that that position carries. Thank you very much for bringing the SRC's weight behind this event, for co-convening this event, and for the provocative and important introduction. I'm very grateful. And thank you so much all. Spokazi, thank you so much for being our facilitator today. And I see many friends in the audience, many luminaries from the academic perspective and from the administrative perspective. Thank you all for taking this time on a Friday to engage with my work. I want to do a few things with this talk. And what I'm trying to do with this book is approach it from a different angle when I do speak about it in different fora. And so I want to look at different dimensions of this book that I haven't explored yet in other events and talks and places, and present it from a unique perspective. I'm well aware that the book is still very new. It was only formally published last week, Wednesday. And so we're in an interesting position with the work in that many people now know about the book, but they don't yet know the book. And I'm realizing that there's a great difference between knowing about a book and knowing a book. And so I'm quite aware that many of you may not have had a chance to read it, much less really internalize it. But I will try to, in this talk, take you through the argument so that when you do approach the work, you do so from a perspective of having the context of the author and the author's own perspective on the work. So that's really my aim today. And because I have a little bit more time today, what I'll do is look at the different chapters in the book and try to give you a flavor for each of the chapters. So the chapter on space, the chapter on law, the chapter on wealth, the chapter on technology, and the chapter on punishment. I won't be able to delve into them in their full depth, but I will be able to give you a snapshot of what you can expect in the book. And hopefully that will outline and describe and depict the overall structure of the book. But before I do that, I'll just try to situate the context of the work, talk a little bit about the ambitions for the work, and then at the end, maybe try to link this work to the contemporary moment in South Africa as we reel from recent moments of upheaval and unrest, or whatever you want to call what we saw over the last few weeks. It's been fascinating to me how this book has been seen through the prism of recent events, even though it was written before them. And I think the book takes us some way towards reappraising those events and more deeply engaging with them. So that's how I'll conclude. But let me just start with
thank you so much. He's
background and context.
Guilty because he just doesn't want to prolong the process and have more consequences.
Ayanda,
so,
I'm not sure if
she just chose
to engage with the conversation yet.
Shorten the process and
but
hopefully get a
I'm not sure if it's possible to mute
or lesser sentence.
Ayanda from the chair.
Marco, are we able to mute?
That's one.
Ayanda,
so I'll just send this to him.
Oh, it's Sonabo. Can you please just mute? Okay, I think
great.
that's sorted. Sorry, Sizwe.
No problem. I was wondering whether there was a disruption in the typical South African fashion, but glad to see that it was just a parallel conversation. So I was talking about the context of the work and just trying to give you a sense of the setting before I delve into some of the substantive arguments that are made here. And this work, The New Apartheid, took 3 years to come together in the main, although it's an idea that has been nagging away at me since I can remember, really, thinking critically about our country. And my first book, Democracy and Delusion, which I also launched at CANRAD, as Spogazi mentioned, was really a take on current affairs and current events. And so that book was 10 essays on 10 different issues in South Africa. I surveyed Marikana, I looked at questions of free education, I explored problems of service delivery, and really tried to look at what was making headlines and delve into that in a deeper way than you might find in journalism, for example, which is often time-bound and unable to apply the rigors that we are able to do in scholarship when we take a slight step back. What I enjoyed about that journey was realizing the reach that books in the public domain rather than just in the academic domain can have, realizing how wise South African audiences actually are, much wiser than many publishers realize. And so writing into the public sphere and into the public space really excited me, and I wanted to do it again. But what frustrated me about that project was that after those current events had subsided and died down, the book didn't age as I wanted it to age, because it was too tied to those events. And so what I set about doing after that work was taking a further step back and trying to go a layer even deeper and beyond current affairs, beyond the questions which currently hog headlines. I wanted to try to diagnose, at least re-diagnose, a kind of central crisis that I thought was plaguing constitutional South Africa. And I was continuously surprised by the way that apartheid has become simultaneously omnipresent and also invisible in our public discourse, in our lives, and how in many ways, as the years roll on into our democracy, our use and invocation of the term apartheid seems to be waning, despite its central importance to understanding our current conjuncture. And I was also struck in the eruptions on South African university campuses in retrospect that much of the narrative focused on questions of decolonization, no doubt an important set of conversations. But even in that critical moment, discourses around apartheid itself were increasingly pushed to the margins as questions of broad colonization were pushed to the center. And so even in our moments of critical reflection, it seemed as though apartheid was something that we wanted to suppress, and that the horror of apartheid, with which I don't think we've fully grappled as a people, is still something we would prefer to keep on the outskirts of our consciousness. So that even if we talk about decolonization, have we talked about de-apartheidization? And if not, why not? So what I wanted to do with this book then is to resurrect apartheid as a token of public debate, to, as J.M. Coetzee once said, reopen the coffin of apartheid and look at the body. And in that process, ask, to what extent is apartheid still present? And I wanted to talk about apartheid as a live question rather than a historical phenomenon alone. And in doing so, I wanted to bring apartheid back into the present and try to contend that far from just being a legacy, far from being an effigy, or far from being a reverberating echo, apartheid is not just something in the past, it's something in the present that also has a future, something that is capable of self-replication, something that is capable of self-reinvention, and something that is capable of adapting around the democratic constraints which we set for this system in 1994. And I wanted to explore to what extent apartheid has not only survived, but actually thrived.
Recording in progress.
Despite the democratic moment. It's a commonly held lament. I often used to say it before. I've heard many people say it before. So I claim no originality in
recording stopped,
suggesting that apartheid has a sense of momentum. But beyond simply acknowledging or realizing that, few scholars have pursued this idea in its full depth at book length. And so the project that I set for myself was to really test under the full light of analytical scrutiny at monograph length, whether a credible case could be made for the persistence of apartheid despite the constitutional order. And by and large, this book is a defense of that position with certain qualifications and entering the necessary caveats. And so that's really the project that I've embarked on. And so what I'd like to do, having set the scene then, is to try and give you a flavor for the book, a flavor for the argument, and give you a sense of how the work unfolds and the argument unfolds. And just to do that, I wanted to let you know how the book flows. So there's an introductory chapter, and that introductory chapter really tries to define the key terms. What I mean by apartheid, which is by no means a stable and easy concept to grasp. What I mean by apartheid being privatized. And then what I'm not arguing, which I've realized as this book takes on a public life of its own. It's currently the best-selling book in South Africa as we speak. I have no idea how that happened, but I think it's testament to to the way in which apartheid is a nerve which when tapped, always sets off a potent set of emotions in our country. And its very suppression, I think, has given rise to a huge interest in this work, for which I wasn't prepared. But having said that, it's also important to say what I'm not arguing. So I do put that in the introduction because I try to limit the argument. And what I do try to say is that this book is not an attempt to dismiss the constitutional order in its entirety. It's not an attempt to dismiss the importance of conferring the franchise to citizens over the age of 18, nor is it to totally dismiss the ambitions of the liberation movement before or even subsequent to 1994. But what I am doing and what I'm firm about is puncturing the over-dramatization of the so-called transition. And I'm trying to take aim at an end of history narrative, which sets up an impossible task for future generations of South Africans in which they can never imagine a future more just than the one they inherited, because the miracle narrative which they have been fed corners them into a definition of justice which is framed as the only possible definition of justice and the best of all possible worlds. And when we set up this end of history narrative and present our current society as living in some kind of afterglow of some kind of miracle, then we undermine the scale of the task that we have now in not only reimagining our society beyond its current limitations, but also in appreciating the scale of the apartheid project, which has in many ways metastasized in this moment and in many ways has also been hidden from view by the pantomime of the democratic celebration. And so ultimately what I'm trying to do is reduce the over-dramatization of the constitutional transition and rather frame South Africa now, far from the end of history, but rather in some kind of transitional moment where there is a future beyond this moment which we can only grasp at now, but which transcends the failures of this moment, the structural failures, which have nothing to do with the headlines that we see on a day-to-day basis in many cases, but is also distinct from the past. And so we may be living in some kind of transitional republic. We also might be living in a transitional republic because this republic might be torn down in a spontaneous uprising. And then that future republic will look very different to this transitional moment, which will be seen as a failure to extricate South Africa from its crises, which then led to a catastrophe. In either way, in either scenario, whether we do imagine something fundamentally more just and then reach towards that, or if the contradictions in our society end up in its implosion, we will look back on this moment far from the end of history. We will look back on this moment as a moment of transition and a moment where we were neither new nor old, but we were in something new. And that crisis is what I'm terming the new apartheid, to contradistinguish the so-called new South Africa that we have been promised we're in. So I thought I'd give you a flavor for some of the chapters, because what I then tried to do, having made this founding argument, is demonstrate the resilience of the new apartheid and its privatized form in different spheres of South African life. So I look at 5 spheres of life, and I begin with the sphere of space. And by space, I just mean our spatial relations, whether we're talking about rural areas, ezilalini, which are exactly far enough from small towns so that they can be reservoirs of labor, but not close enough that people can access them easily when they need to travel there to get basic goods and resources. Whether I look at urban South Africa and I take snapshots and assess data which takes snapshots from a bird's eye view and looks down at the racial composition of South Africa's neighborhoods and shows stark and horrifying segregation, which hasn't even begun to scratch the surface of apartheid engineering. Or whether I look and zoom into spaces that we think are desegregated, only to reveal that when we zoom in at smaller and smaller scales, even though we can't see apartheid at larger scales anymore, it becomes stark the smaller the scale. So that even within places that have been desegregated, apartheid hierarchies continue to persist. And all that's happened is that the size of the borders has reduced, but the relations within the borders at smaller scales has been preserved. And we see this in elite spaces like private schools. We see this in elite spaces like corporate spaces. We see this in elite residential spaces, quote unquote, where gated communities, residents associations, and various private forms of control have reenacted the worst excesses of apartheid in the private sphere at smaller scales as it has dissipated at larger and larger scales in the state. And so that chapter is really a look, and it opens with a look at Orania as the prime example of this attempt, and how the Orania project evolved into a realization that no, we can't make it as explicit as this. Those who want to secede from the central South African state, we have to create a set of borders that are not as obvious as either the apartheid borders or even Orania borders, but are only really understandable by those who create the borders, but are not necessarily easily distinguishable from those who are outside the borders of these urban enclaves. And incidentally, if you look at the solidarity movement, this umbrella movement of AfriForum, the Freedom Front Plus, various private institutions which call themselves do-it-yourself institutions, there's a very clear project underway, and that project is for an Afrikaner minority to usurp the state where this minority happens to be living, to extricate the responsibilities of living in a broader political community, and to remake a private state within a state. Ironically, a process of reverse Bantustanization, where a new state within a state is created, but this time it's a privatized state where those people who inherited apartheid forms of privilege can insulate themselves from the wider crises of the state by retreating within in a far more sophisticated way than we are accustomed to when we consider secession as a 20th century phenomenon. I also survey the question of law, and I attack what I call constitutional triumphalism, a view that the settlement, which may or may not have been necessary in 1994, or at least in the period of transition, represents the high point of justice as we can conceive it as a society. And I attempt to demonstrate that the conception of justice that we have created for ourselves in the constitutional order is an impoverished conception of justice, one which could be greatly expanded. And I trace the injustices of the present to some of the failures of imagination which are present in our founding conception of justice, and show that we can transcend the conception of justice that we have created in the constitutional order, which I think is an unduly narrow conception. I also show, or seek to show, that the realm of private law, in other words, law which governs relations between individuals rather than relations between individuals and the state. So laws which govern contractual relations, laws which define what it means to be a person within a legal institution, laws which deal with property relations, actually run on a parallel track often to constitutional law and constitutional jurisprudence. And I sit back and I say, in your everyday life, which one affects you most? The contracts into which you enter, the property laws which circumscribe your ability to move and acquire things and discharge of things, or the Constitution in its distant realm, which largely deals with political parties and broad questions, and only deals with a certain number of cases a year at the Constitutional Court. Which one holds more sway over people's lives? And it's fascinating, we can get into it in the questions, but you look at the realm of the law of contract in South Africa and you realize that there are tens of millions of contracts in our country as we speak. And there is no way that we're going to extricate ourselves from the power relations which those contracts impose simply by declaring some constitutional imperative. And I say that that constitutional imperative is limited anyway. So where are we really when we look at our entire legal edifice and the relations of legality into which we've entered since 1994, the common law which has infused this private area of law and dates back not only to apartheid, but even to earlier forms of colonialism. I'm mindful of time, so I will try to give you further snapshots, perhaps at a quicker rate. But the next section on wealth tries to explore this idea of the privatization of apartheid by looking at the increased privatization of wealth and the transformations of wealth that we have seen. And what became clear to me is that we have seen profound transformations of wealth in South Africa, to the extent that wealth has changed its form. But when you start tracing the new form back to the original owners, you find that there have been staggering resemblances between the apartheid period and the present period. So wealth has increasingly globalized and been outsourced and pushed out of the country in a massive moment of capital flight after 1994. It has also been broken into little pieces, or smaller and smaller pieces. So the 5 apartheid conglomerates deconglomerated and broke themselves into various different decentralized pieces. And so we have far more firms now, and we have far more companies themselves. And so it looks like wealth has transformed and gone in lots of different directions. And it has, it's gone overseas, and inside it's decentralized. But when you trace and re-centralize it, you realize that all these different pockets of wealth come back to the same 5 sources often. Maybe 6 now. And when you go overseas, you realize that even those global networks of wealth are even less under South African control, despite the fact that they also benefit a very narrow South African minority. So the transformations in wealth that we've seen since 1994 should give us terrifying pause for the resilience of apartheid wealth structures to reimagine, reinvent themselves, and avoid any criticism because of the democratic moment. And this idea of avoiding criticism became very important to the late planners of apartheid in the 1980s, because so much international criticism was being focused on apartheid. A solution had to be found where wealth could be preserved, but the criticism could be deflected, and the sanctions could be deflected. And so what we saw in 1994 was a way of preserving wealth while deflecting criticism. And this is where we are today. In our celebration, we have forgotten that major pools of wealth have been protected, and have found that protection through the protection of the miracle narrative, but also increasingly through the co-optation and privatization of the ANC itself, which is now a co-participant in these wealth pools. In the chapter on technology, I tried to look at the privatization of apartheid through the new digital lives which we are now all compelled to live. And one of the most fascinating confluences of the constitutional order is that just as South Africa was democratizing, there was also a rise in personal computing and the rise of the internet. And so all of our democratic lives have also run parallel to this new rise in digital computing. And what I do in that chapter is I try to assess the extent to which these digital technologies and algorithms and ways of organizing societies have actually reinforced apartheid patterns of social categorization and have algorithmicized our own unique forms of segregation as a society. And what's fascinating to note is that Verwoerd's fascination with biometric classification, in other words, taking people's fingerprints and being able to know who they were, categorize them from above by their own physical characteristics, and then impose moral content onto those characteristics. Well, that was a very ambitious project in the 1960s. But the sheer extent of data that exists about us today, biometric data, psychographic data, the constant surveillance under which we're under from a private network of security cameras, whether we go to a mall, a public institution, whether we're driving on a road, would make Verwoerd blush. And so that, combined with social media technologies, which are increasingly designed to make like-minded people meet each other and reinforce their privately held beliefs, overlays onto the South African situation a new digital form of segregation, which maps onto spatial forms of segregation that I mentioned in the space chapter. And then finally, on questions of criminal punishment, I search into South Africa's vast system of criminal punishment, of mass incarceration. Our rates of criminal incarceration rival those of some of the most carceral states in the world. The United States is in a league of its own, but South Africa has routinely ranked in the top 20 carceral states in the world. And we have increasingly tried to punish our way out of our social and economic and political crises. And not only have we done that, but we have created a prison population which has more Black people and also has a greater percentage of Black people than even in the apartheid era, where there were laws designed to criminalize Blackness. Not only that, but very similar to in other parts of the world, those who are in the criminal justice system are far and disproportionately those who have committed petty offenses or drug-related offenses, And those who have committed violent crimes are prosecuted at rates often below 5%, for extremely violent crimes often below 2%. And so while we think that we have solved problems of a prodigious social scale by incarcerating at disproportionate rates, what we have really done is use the prison system as a symbol of Black punishment, while never really actually punishing those who do actually commit crimes against society. And increasingly, that network of criminal punishment and criminal justice is itself privatizing, so that we have private prosecutorial impulses now, which are celebrated. We have private forms of policing where security guards outnumber both the police and the army by staggering amounts. Combined, the police and the army don't amount to the army of private security guards. And access to justice itself in courts is also increasingly a question of private accumulation. So those are the chapters. I'm mindful that we don't have much time and that I've already indulged the audience and the moderator with overstretching my time limits, but it's been a real pleasure to delve a bit deeper into some of the arguments. What I'll do, just to end off in the last 2 minutes, is what I promised to do, which is try to refract some of these questions through the lens of the recent upheavals / unrest / whatever you want to call it. I don't think we quite know yet. And one of the things that was fascinating for me about that moment was, to be sure, part of it related to an ANC internal factional battle, which had to do with the incarceration of former President Zuma. But the way and the direction in which it evolved is what I think is fascinating. And the end point, one of the key endpoints being the mall. And if you trace the arguments I make about the privatization of apartheid, I think you begin to see that forms of political rebellion, even when spontaneous, often unknowingly aim at centers of power in a society. And why were people not going to government buildings and government offices, as they often have and often do? Why was the mall this lightning rod of rebellion and, yes, sometimes criminality? Well, it's because in our lives, in people's lives in South Africa today, malls are the symbol of the new apartheid in many ways. The private security guards, the privatized spaces, the dream of commercialized, commodified consumption, the conglomerates which hide behind lots of different brand names, are the epicenter of power in the new apartheid. And so we would do well, I think, and we have a lot more thinking to do about this, to think deeply about that moment and what was being said in that moment. Many things were being said at the same time, but one of them was this question of the disruption at the point of consumption. And why did the point of consumption become such a popular place around which this unrest / upheaval / insurrection why was that such an important location? If you read the new apartheid, I think you will gain further insight into that question. I can promise you that the book is filled with far more questions and provocations. I've only scratched the surface of what I tried to do in the work, but I hope this gives you a flavor for the work, and I really look forward to your engagements and your provocations, your critiques, and your thoughts as we try to digest this work over the next few weeks. And I particularly look forward to Pedro's response and the conversation to follow. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sizwe. And if you've just joined us, colleagues, welcome. Feel free to join in the conversation, of course, via our chat section here on Zoom. And if you're joining us via our live streaming on the CANRAD YouTube page, you can also just leave your comments and questions, which we will bring into the conversation momentarily. I want to now give the platform over to our respondent and second speaker, Pedro Mzileni. I'm just going to do a brief reading of a brief bio of Pedro. Pedro Mzileni is responsible for internationalization at home, student development, and strategic programs at the Nelson Mandela University's International Office. He is a PhD in sociology candidate here at Nelson Mandela University in our Department for Sociology and Anthropology. Also, quite interestingly, it seems on our lineup today, a former SRC president as well, which seems to be the theme. So, Pedro, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Spogazi, and good afternoon to you, to the author of this book and keynote speaker today, Dr. Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh, and to everyone joining us on this sunny Friday afternoon at the Nelson Mandela University in Gqeberha, and wherever you may be in the country or elsewhere. I believe the protocol has been duly observed on my behalf, so I also just want to acknowledge everyone, colleagues who has joined us. So within the 10 minutes I have been given, I want to first congratulate Sizwe for this timeless publication that is well written and so easy to read for anyone who lays its hands on it. And I want to say, as someone who considers himself as a sociology student who is still at the beginning of grasping the full weight of this discipline, this is one of the most important texts I would strongly recommend in sociological theory and practice across all its levels. And for those concerned about the transformative potential of our society, both in public service and also in the commercial industry, the academy, and the progressive activist networks, this text, I want to say this confidently, this text provides major theoretical and purposeful programs we could possibly craft and implement with a more radical language and intent to qualitatively elevate our methods of struggle as we pursue a revolutionary path to liberate our society and the continent. So I want to consider you, Sizwe, as the Lembede of our times. And I want to take this opportunity and say this purposefully and deliberately, because you see, Sizwe, sometimes we live in times where, as peers, especially as young people of our generation, we sometimes hold back from giving credit and acknowledgement to those who are excellent around us for a number of reasons, you know. Others choose to be silent for their own choice, others out of pure jealousy, or a number of things, you know. It's a crazy, crazy, crazy generation and time that we find ourselves under. So I want to, and this is me to you, I want to really consider you the Lembede of our times, you know. The last time we met in 2017, which was just 4 to 5 years ago, you were launching your first book. And now, just 5 years ago, you have your second book on the table. and you've also recently completed your PhD. And this book now that you've written, it is the bestseller on every major bookstore across the country in just 8 days of its publishing. This is an incredible milestone, my friend. And I want to take this opportunity to congratulate you at making this groundbreaking achievement at just the tender age of 32, like Anton Lembede, indeed. Secondly, your book is taking us to the importance of historicizing. It is very important to historicize and to utilize the archive and the subjects into multiple interpretations. If you want to grasp sociological reality as it takes place in our present times, it is very important to historicize. My students would know, I would always say this to them, that there isn't any Chinese wall between the past, the present, and also the future. All these phases are intertwined. They were shaped at a particular point in time and context. And I also want to borrow from Aslam Fatah from Stellenbosch University when I want to make the following point, that you must remember, colleagues, that the program of colonialism and oppression was very serious and intentional in South Africa for many, many decades and centuries, right? But something specific about 1948 happened. And these are some of the things we need to keep knocking into the memory of young people, wherever we go. 1948 was the formalization of race as the central barometer of how South African public life and even private life is organized, right? 1948, the formalization of apartheid now as a state program, right? So race now got entrenched as the major apex barometer of organizing both public and private life. And now notice again what happened between 1955 and 1985, right? Those 30 years. From 1955 up to 1985, apartheid as a state program was entrenched into law, into the economy, into the political, the science of South Africa, basically in the consciousness of both the colonizer and the colonized for that period of 30 years. And then when it formally was done away with, it then developed its own life and it continued up until today, right? So that period of 30 years between the 50s and the 80s, that was a period where apartheid as a state program, where race as a central barometer was being deeply entrenched, violently and otherwise, deeply in the consciousness of the colonizer and the colonized. And then thereafter, it lived its own life. That is why Sizwe puts it very well. I think it's somewhere in the introduction or the first chapter, that if you look at how now public life and private life is organized, where there was a law on something or an aspect under apartheid, you'll find that today there's a particular fee now that has replaced that law. For an example, if you look at the extension of Universities Act of 1959, which paved the way for the formation of the University of Port Elizabeth, which is where we are, which is now called the Nelson Mandela University. If you look at that act from 1959, it was clear that no Black people or people of color or coloreds are allowed into the university. That law has been replaced now with a fee, right? If you cannot afford right, the fees, then you're not allowed to be in the university, right? And naturally, because you are poor because you are black because you are poor, the very same extension of the Universities Act in 1959 still applies to the very same black people today that it applied to at the beginning. And I make this point in one of the chapters of my doctoral thesis, where I look at the relationship between the city and the university more critically, where I argue that this city where we are, Gqeberha, and the university attached to it, which is the University of Port Elizabeth, both of them are an apartheid enterprise, and they have a racial political economy which holds the existing budgeting, governance, operations, and policy formulations within colonial convictions. So you'd find that in 2021, yes, Nelson Mandela University is changing organizationally, but institutionally, it remains embedded in economic exclusion, racism, and patriarchization. And probably it will remain in that manner institutionally forever, unless deliberate work that this put on the table. Let me try to draw towards a conclusion quickly before, as I'm landing. This book is an intentional protest and a call for youth action, therefore, on 3 levels. Firstly, it invites us to take the ontology of oppression and dispossession more seriously. The young Black sociologists and even everyone in the humanities network who are doing serious work on searching the archive and the intellectual traditions of our people, which is what Nomalanga Mkhize calls ukufukuza. That work is very important because it is that work, that commitment to the ontology of oppression and dispossession and taking it seriously, that is going to invoke a language and a set of terms that are deliberate in recognizing that part of the democratic or the so-called post-apartheid project was actually to erase people, right? And when you erase people, you also erase their injuries, right? So the erasure of apartheid injuries, both physical and also epistemic and emotional injuries, right, is some of the work that we need to unearth more seriously and deliberately. And it is what informs actually the existing politics of how law, technology, punishment, space, and wealth are organized and how people justify each of these, which is what Madlingozi calls the difference between the bad victim and the good victim. So a commitment, therefore, to this ontology of oppression and dispossession and invoking this language, right, of naming things the way they're supposed to be named. Because if you call the existing order of South Africa as the new apartheid, you are advancing a particular paradigm which departs radically from what we've been used to as a hegemonic language of identifying and defining the time and the context and the space that we find ourselves in, right? And this is part of the disorientation that we usually find amongst those who are leading us in public service. So once we take that ontology of oppression and dispossession seriously, we'll also get to see the memory and even Spokazi, the silences, right, that have been pushed through by the usage of this language that seeks to erase what happened, what needs to be done. Let me stop there for now. I will come back when we go to the conversation on the question and answer session. Thank you so much, and well done, Sizwe, on this great work. Thank you, Spogas.
Thank you so much, Pedro, and thanks also just for engaging and just for giving us an offering as well of just different ways in which we can read some of the arguments that Dr. Sizwe is making here. Colleagues, I will open this to a round of engagements, questions, comments. If you'd like to engage with Dr. Sizwe and Pedro, I see there's a hand coming up as well, so I'd like to urge you to raise your hands. So this is how we're going to do it, just so I can put some rules into place. I'm going to ask each individual who I will give access to use their mic and to join the conversation. I'm going to ask that they speak for about 2 to 3 minutes. So just get to your point in 2 or 3 minutes if possible. Other colleagues joining us here can of course drop a comment in the chat section or leave a question in the chat section. Okay, so I'm seeing one hand up at the moment. Just going to go down. Okay. So just for now, I'm going to take the first hand that's up. It's Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh. You can unmute your mic.
Thank you so much, Spokas. Thank you so much, Sizwe. I'm looking forward to reading your book. Exceptional work you did there. I just want to make a comment in terms of the people's fight and what often might seem as to one, when one speaks about the new apartheid, are we addressing what the residues are or how the residue of apartheid or apartheid itself has turned into what it is, the animals we are facing today. But also a kind of, maybe it's something you are dealing with in your work, Sizwe. I would like you to comment on, the constitutional fight in terms of people fighting for constitutional right was not a let's go to the boxing ring fight. It was a radical commitment in which Black people were lynched, in which people were killed. And I sometimes struggle when the celebration is just all we did get from apartheid was the constitutional right, as if the constitutional fight itself was not one that was, that was done by the people. So I just want you to speak about that recognition. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Sis Ntombi. I think it's Kungile okanye Kungile. I'm just not sure how I'm pronouncing that. You can unmute your mic. Kungile, can you?
Yes. Thank you so much, Program Director. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. Greetings to Dr. Sizwe and Pedro. Pedro is my township fellow. So it's very interesting arguments, to be honest. I've been trying to type the comments, but I'm finding it difficult. And I think the reason, because here Dr. Sizwe has identified challenges in a democratic society, in a democratic state. And I'm trying not to be bothered about the title of the book, but somehow I'm feeling that it defeats the purpose. I'm not sure how we should have linked it, but because here we are sitting as young people and progressively we are trying to solve all the identified gaps or spheres that he has mentioned. And at some point I did break, so I'm not sure if part of the spheres did he talk anything about corruption, but I think also it is a major factor. He spoke lengthily, about issues. I understand the link, that because of the administration of these spheres, now and also because of the link to the apartheid system, we are having a challenge. For example, I know that most of us are still struggling with the law, the 99-year lease law, that most farms, those young boys will claim that this is my dad's farm, but however, it's under a lease. But tell me, the reality is that if it's a lease for 99 years, obviously there's much construction that has happened, and the value, of the construction that took place now makes it hard for anyone else to take that farm, because ideally it was issued out for development purposes and also for economic purposes, especially if that young man who inherited the farm continuously make means of production around it. So you cannot just take it, and the 99 years maybe still left about 5 years, and you see that it's productive. Now, it's the law that was set up, then, and now we are in a democracy. So I'm saying I understand the link. And yes, we do have those that farms, for example, I'll specifically talk about farms that are abandoned, and someone else wants to develop property in that space because maybe the area is no longer suitable for farming and etc. And they, African people now struggle, with the municipality to actually get that land for the purposes of development. But you find that white people find it easy, you don't know if they can read the book well around these laws or what, but they find it easy to find land, especially in places like Gauteng, to develop. And all these spaces, they are not theirs. It's that 99-year lease project. But with us, African people, we find it difficult. So I'm saying it's interesting, and I would have loved that he opened it as a form of saying, because having to identify all the spheres coming down to the 21st century technology, how do we correct, the administration? Yes, could be the policies are correct. The sustainable development goals, are always right on point, but the issue is with the administration. And also, how do we make sure that we implement them correctly? Yes, so there's a lot, and I need to read the book, and I can't take your time, sorry. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Budwan. I'm not seeing another hand, colleagues, at the moment, so I'm going to soon just bring in Dr. Sizwe and Pedro to just comment, then answer. Perhaps just a third one there for you to maybe just comment on, Dr. Sizwe. And Pedro was talking about, towards the end, he was talking about, this erasure of physical scars, but also these hidden scars, right? That this post democratic dispensation assumes, that they are gone, and it just the image of the book cover itself just came up again to me, the stitching of the old and the new, and I want you to perhaps comment to the intentions behind that particular image for the book cover itself. So, and then I will allow Pedro to just comment if he feels inclined to. Dr. Mpofu?
Thanks so much, Spogazi. And let me just start by thanking Pedro for his interventions and for engaging so deeply with the work, but also for his very kind comments. And just to return many thanks to him, and also to acknowledge the excellent work he's done as an activist and is doing as a scholar. And I can't tell you how profoundly gratifying it is to finally hear other brilliant minds intervening on this work and riffing off this work and challenging it, but also agreeing with parts of it, and really starting a genuine national debate inaugurated by a new generation. And there are some profoundly exciting minds and people in this generation who are challenging so many of our long cherished myths and abiding assumptions. And Pedro's certainly one of them. And he gets to the crux of what I'm trying to do with this work by focusing on the importance of historicizing, also by bringing different times into conversation. All too often, I think our conversations around one particular moment ignore the past or the future when we talk about the present, such as happens often in journalism and media. We're too present focused, and so we can't see a new future or understand the structural problems of the past that inform the present. But sometimes when we talk about the future, we forget the legacies of the past with which we have to grapple. And in this book, I'm trying to bring all those temporalities into one conversation about how the past, present, and future from this particular vantage point in the present can be rethought and reconceptualized. And again, he gets to the crux when he identifies the replacement of laws with fees. This is such a key aspect of the new apartheid. Where there was once a law, there is now a fee. And the financialization of apartheid barriers, the liberalization and then financialization, was a very important move, because what it did was it took the problem of borders and the borders that were created by apartheid ideology. It took them from a problem of state control and a state burden and transformed them into a source of private profit. And in that moment and in that move, apartheid became a pay-as-you-go system rather than a contract system, as it were. And the payer changed to the user. So we now pay for apartheid, not the state. And the private sphere benefits from those payments. And where there is now a fee, there is also a recipient of that fee. And the recipient of that fee is all too often somehow linked to apartheid forms of privilege. And so, yes, absolutely, this book is an intentional protest and a protest against the dominant paradigm that we have been fed, and an attempt, maybe a first or one of the first early attempts to reconceptualize where we really are. To briefly then come on to some of the questions, Sizwe says something very important, and I thank you for that question, because one of the dangers with how this book might be looked at is that I am hello. Just making sure I can be heard.
Yeah.
One of the dangers of this work is that it may appear before you have a chance to read it as if I am disregarding the sacrifices that people made to uproot formal apartheid and am ungratefully saying we're nowhere. And I appreciate that is an impression that might be created through the title, or it's one of the ways that the work could be read before it's read. But that's not what I'm trying to do. And you'll see that I hardly try to suggest that, I hardly try to enter this debate about whether there was a sellout in 1994, because I'm more interested in where we are right now. And I'm even prepared to concede that the political dynamics of the late 1980s and early 1990s may have necessitated a particular kind of settlement then, But why do we have to accept that settlement now, is my question. And so it may well be the case, and a historical argument may well be made, that that moment represented an advance from apartheid, which it certainly did. But what happened in the intervening 3 decades? Why did we fall victim to the idea that that was the ultimate victory, rather than an intermediate step in a much more important victory? And why have we done nothing about it in the last 3 decades? So that's the one thing. The other thing I would say about why I think that the sellout debate leaves us at a dead end often is that it assumes that the ANC was the only party that had agency in the negotiations for the constitutional order, as if they came to the negotiating table and decided what should happen. And instead of saying that the negotiators at that time sold out, and maybe there's some truth to the idea, but the more interesting question for me is, what did the apartheid negotiators want? And what did they get? We seldom ask that question. They came to the table with a plan. They didn't just come to the table and say, oh, we've lost, we give up, we hand over everything, change the country as you see fit. They realized there needed to be a democracy, but even if there was a democracy, they wanted to preserve key forms of power by privatizing much of what was controlled by the state. And so the real question for me is, whose plan won? The plan of ANC and liberation planners who thought, if we institute a constitution, then justice will automatically flow if we give it enough time by putting political power in the hands of people above the age of 18. That was a gamble, which may have made sense in a particular moment. But another gamble was made, which is, from the perspective of apartheid power, do we really need this burden of managing the state? What if we give up the state, but we privatize most forms of power that the state was able to control anyway? And if we unduly dramatize the constitutional transition, what we do is we erase the agency of the apartheid negotiators, and we imagine that they didn't have a plan for the future society. And one of the scariest things about my reading and my delving into the apartheid archive, especially in the 1980s, was that there was a fascination with this idea that if we implant apartheid deeply enough, then no one will ever be able to undo it, or at least no future generation in our lifetimes. So did the apartheid negotiators concede a constitutional democracy because they calculated that they had seeded apartheid so deeply that it didn't matter if we became a constitutional democracy? And to what extent were they right? Well, what ultimately I think happened was that elements of that apartheid plan have come into this future, and elements of the opposing plan have come into the future, and we are a society in stagnation because of it. And it's very important not to underemphasize the sacrifices people made for freedom. But I think that's all the more reason why we should be calling for further liberation, because people didn't sacrifice just so that we had a half-baked version of justice. They sacrificed so that we got the real thing. And in honor of their sacrifices, I think we have to be critical and we have to be cynical of the state that we're in now. And then I'll just come to the questions about the title and the cover. Kulungile and Spogazi as well. Using the word apartheid is not something one does lightly. And what you'll see in the book is that I engage with what apartheid really is. And it's a very difficult concept to actually grasp. And it's one we haven't really engaged with as a political philosophy, because that's ultimately part of what it is. What is apartheid? It's not actually very clear beyond benches and separation and documentaries that are somewhere in our minds. What was the idea? The idea is a very deep idea about living in one political community where we are pushed together by the external borders, but where we create internal borders within that political community so that the forces which push us together are also kept apart. So it's a form of very intimate separation, a paradoxical form of being at once entangled, but at once worlds apart. And how do you create a society where we walk past each other every day, we brush shoulders, we are in each other's intimate spaces, but we are also worlds away from each other, and we never actually come into real contact across various binaries of race, gender, sexual orientation, religion, political persuasion. And so it's more than just racial segregation. And this is why I invoke the term apartheid, Kungile. And when you read the book, I think you'll see why I use the term, but I appreciate the dangers of the term too. And then finally, on the cover of the book, I'm very glad, Spogazi, that you even noticed what's happening on the cover, because it just first looks like a blur of colors. And then when you do look deeper, it's two flags which are stitched together, which is the apartheid flag and the current South African flag. And what I was trying to do there, working with a brilliant designer, Tsepo Mosweu, was find a way to depict this tension that we find ourselves in which apartheid is still so much a part of where we are, but it's not the same kind of apartheid, and that there is a new vision that's struggling to be born, but the new vision isn't in itself a perfect vision. And so what we have is these flags within each other. But what was also fascinating to me was when you put the apartheid flag alongside the current South African flag, you get a kind of rainbow effect, because you start to see different colors of the rainbow. And so what is the Rainbow Nation? The Rainbow Nation is not the Rainbow Nation we were promised. The Rainbow Nation is the new apartheid.
Thanks so much, Doc. Let me just check with Pedro, if you would like to respond, please. Pedro? Oh.
Yeah, thank you, Spogazi. I will also maybe try to also target the two comments that came from the two speakers that came through. One, Ukongile Obongwana, and also Professor Woni as well. Firstly, to Ukongile, the aspect of law. Yeah? If you look at, again, I'm going to go back to the 1948 moment, right? If you go back to 1948, when apartheid became a state program. Now, the beautiful thing about the apartheid government is that everything that they wanted to do, literally everything that they wanted to do, they always passed it through parliament. So they would have an act of parliament for it to be done. So if you look at the laws they were passing in the 50s and in the 60s, yeah, let's focus on that 10, 15-year period, the 50s and the 60s. One of the laws that they passed during that period was the law to control the exchange rate of South Africa. The exchange rate today, that goes up and down willy-nilly. You know, the rand to the US dollar the rand to the British pound. In the 50s, they passed laws to control that exchange rate, purely for two reasons. One, the first reason was that the apartheid state at that time, it was being rejected by global capital, especially big capital in the European and the American markets. So they didn't have a market to sell the raw material that they were asking Black people to dig down in the gold mines. So the apartheid government, therefore, was forced now to build an industrial and a manufacturing sector of its own that is going to process the raw material within the borders of South Africa and then trade within the borders of South Africa at that time. And this was law passed by the apartheid state at that time. And part of that program was also to create these manufacturing sites on the Bantustans, right? So people who are from East London today, they would know their parents that they speak of factories that were established in that region. King Williamstown had Dagama. There were industries in Queenstown, in Mthatha. In fact, most big townships in the Eastern Cape, if you notice their history, most of them, they grew during that period of the 50s and the 60s, which was the manufacturing period of the apartheid regime. And Black people were being pushed into those Bantustans, which was called Ciskei and Transkei at the time. They were being pushed into these industries, these fake manufacturing sites, as a form of labor, right? Because, as you would know, manufacturing is one of the key sites of mass creation of jobs globally. If you want to talk about job creation, you're talking about the manufacturing economy. And the manufacturing economy, most of the time, it absorbs young people in the main, right? So our grandparents in the 50s and the 60s, they were getting employed in these manufacturing and industrial sites, and including the mining industry. And that is where that generation born in the 50s and 60s and 70s, which are our parents now, were being born from. It was during that era. Yeah. So now that period also, if you read, there's a book written by professor in our institution, Professor Christie van der Vesterhuizen, on the rise and fall of the National Party. One of the programs also of 1948 was to address the question of the poor white, the poor Afrikaner. So the apartheid state after 1948 going into the 50s and the 60s, laws were being used to make that state extremely powerful and actually dictate terms to the business sector to grow and industrialize and equip white people with economic power, right? But here's the funny thing then, and Sizwe touches on this aspect of space and the Bantustan economy, the manufacturing Bantustan economy. I think it's on the first, on the chapter on space and wealth, right? And how those Bantustans were used to legitimize the white supremacy of the time through these industries, through these laws being passed by the apartheid state. But here's the funny thing. Post-94, here comes the ANC. The ANC, what it does, it negotiates this power in 94. And then, as the markets open up, right, and part of it's also its feasible permission to allow South African markets to open up. The manufacturing sector now begins to collapse across the country. The factories close at Timbaza, they close Dagama, they collapse, and the unemployment rate increases, and it has never declined since then. And what it does in 96, it hands back that power back to the market to say, look, white capital, here is political power, here is economic power back to you. Transform South Africa for us, right? And obviously, the market is not going to do that for you. It does not have transformative convictions or intentions whatsoever. And hence then you see the persisting, right? The persisting racialization, the persisting apartheid carrying on through now, driven as this intersecting force, both from the aspect of the economy, politics, and social life up until today, right? If you look at the patterns of unemployment in this country, students who do economics, I always say to them, when the unemployment rate is being presented by the Statistics General, don't take it at face value that, you know, the unemployment rate is 25% and then the story ends there. Zoom into those statistics and you will see that when we speak about unemployment in South Africa, we're speaking about the people who do not have access to work in racial terms. So unemployment is the racism. Unemployment is racism in South Africa, right? Because the population percentage of white people who are unemployed is below 5% in this country. So every working adult who is white, they are standing on full employment as a race, right? But the structural problems of unemployment continue to face this black cohort of the population, especially young black people who are graduates, right? The unemployment rate will continue to multiply. Why? Because the apartheid commercial enterprise of where the manufacturing base was built from has collapsed. That is why graduates who are black are not going to find work in South Africa, right? In other words, the patterns of apartheid continue to live with us today in full force than ever before. And probably they're going to continue to the future that we're heading to. So when you look at structures of apartheid and the economy and the sociology that underpins these patterns, right? You need to look at them deeper from that perspective. And this is what the law has done, Kungile, in getting us to where we are. Can the Constitution be used to decolonize and turn around what I have described? I don't know. Time will tell. Lastly, do I still have time to go to the last ones, guys? I wanted to go to, yeah, okay. Let me then go to Professor Wong as well. The question of injury and memory and actually knowing apartheid for what it was and what it did, you know. It was not fought on a ring with equal rules, where in the blue corner there was Verwoerd, and then in the red corner there was Mandela. There was no boxing match there. That system was incredibly violent, right? People were killed, people were hanged. You watched your brother being killed right next to you by the police, right? Fathers and mothers left their children at the age of 2 years, right? They go sleep in a forest in Angola or Tanzania. When they come back, their children are 32 years. Imagine you left your child at the age of 2 years, you come back, they are 32. I mean, that is extremely violent. That's an injury I cannot explain. And there's no price for that injury. There's no time limit. This language of it's been 20 years since 94, hey, Letona, you can't measure that injury, right? In fact, that injury must never be forgotten. It must be amplified on every generation of Black people forever. It has no price, you know? So this is what I call this ontology of dispossession, and oppression that we need to know in order to fix the language that we use to describe terms. I think that's the problem. The language we use now needs to be turned around, and we need to now name things the way they are. And I think that is what this book is trying to do, to historicize properly and name things the way they are. And I think also, Prof. Oni, more work needs to be added to this book itself. And it is that archival work, this digging that we are busy doing now in revitalizing the humanities, the digging of the archive to put on the table many more silenced memories and stories and ideas and sciences on the table that are going to make this message, continue and conscientize each and every young person from this point onwards, because we can't continue now using the old terms that we can see that they're not working. They're not taking us anywhere. We keep coming back to the same beginning because we are being disorientated by these decontextualized terms that we've been using. So maybe Sizwe, as I wrap up, so maybe Sizwe, it might be that apartheid was so violent such that South Africans just wanted anything available to just break through. Like anything better than apartheid. Can it please just come and we break through and breathe? Could that maybe be the reason why we are here, and therefore we now need to formulate a new agenda? Yeah, those are some of the questions I have for us. Thank you so much.
I will give Dr. Sizwe an opportunity to also just engage you, Pedro, and colleagues. I'm seeing quite positive comments. Thank you so much for engaging in the chat section as well. I'm seeing a question. I'm going to ask if there is, a burning hand. If someone wants to ask a question, this is the time for you to indicate, and I will allow you to unmute your mic. So now's the time for anyone to indicate if they would like to just give an offering to the engagement. I'm going to read a question from David while I wait to see if there's any engagement coming in the chat section. David says, does privatization of power of key areas necessarily mean the state does not have power to acquire or access the privatized power? Or also the idea that those who are part of the state are themselves part of or influenced by private power? So, for example, we see that a number of people in public office are part and parcel of the big companies. That way, they have no obligation to act in contradiction, but in line with the privatized power, because they themselves have become part of it. So it now becomes hard to distinguish the two, though there's a small door open to give illusion of inclusion of power. And David says, of course, correct me if I misunderstood the point. Okay. I'm just checking to see if there are any other comments, questions that need to come into the engagement. I don't see any hands. Whoever is handling tech can just let me know, Putsanwabo or Marco, if anything's happening. Okay, nothing from YouTube. Thank you so much. There is a question coming from Kungile saying, what's your view of the state of corruption? Yeah. And then I'm also just looking at the time as well. There's one more coming in. Okay, we'll take one more. Linda Smith saying, this comment. This has been an incredibly important discussion. I hope that the recording will be made available. Yes, of course. All right. And they're also just saying they'd like to also just bring this discussion into the classroom. All right. Thank you so much, Linda. And thank you, everyone, for commenting and engaging. I'm looking at the time, colleagues, and just out of respect for everyone's commitments, I'm wondering if I should allow you to answer those questions and give closing comments all in one, or if you'd like to first answer the questions first. So let's just check, Dr. Mpofu, which one will work best for you?
Yeah, I think let's do it all in one.
Okay.
To also thank everyone for bearing with this conversation for so long on a Friday.
Right. Okay. It's just that one question from David. So in that case, I just want to check if Pedro, you want to just respond to anything, so that you go first and Dr. Mpofu will close off for us. Pedro, just let me know.
No, I think Dr. Mpofu can wrap it up for us. I'm good, Spokas. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Pedro. All right, Dr. Mpofu. And then I maybe just want to add just one more comment, perhaps. As you come into the platform, you may turn on your video, Dr. Mpofu. A part of course, what you're mentioning quite earlier is how Hendrik Verwoerd constructs apartheid with an amalgamation and a multitude of various factors that are so interlinked, and that it's so unfair to take them out and piece them out as separate issues that now are all part of the problem, right? And perhaps maybe what I want you to perhaps comment on is what's not explicitly in the book. Pedro mentioning quite a little bit earlier issues of language, which I mean is still quite a debate in our basic education, just merely basic education, but also higher education space as well. Just a language and empowerment when it comes to how we use language for the transferring of knowledge, if you like, or medium of construction. Maybe another theme is religion. The NG Kerk was quite essential in terms of regulating also just ideas of morality, right, who's moral under the apartheid state. And maybe also linked to that gender as well, as a theme that's not coming necessarily explicitly. And how that has been framed and continues to be framed. And I mean, we see that also with, I would say the erasure of women, but also the emasculation of Black men as well, right? And those are some of the tensions, of course, that exist within those things. So yeah, I just, if you could just comment on that as you close. All right. And then just, one more. I received a private message, a DM here in my Zoom, from someone who's quite a fan of yours, and they were quite sad that this book does not come with a musical offering, and they were wondering if, of course, you want to, for the culture, drop some bars, just there, if that would be possible. Yeah.
Ingxaki yami is that ndindala for ukuba umrapper ngoku. That's ingxaki yami, and I've realized that now I'm 32, this thing of dropping bars is starting to not look as cool as it did when I was 22. But thanks so much, Spokazi, everybody who asked questions, Kungile, Professor Wongi, Pedro, for your interventions. Again, my profound appreciation to CANRAD, the SRC, Poncho, and also to all of you for giving your time up today. Okay, I'll end with something that's kind of like a wrap, but let me get to the questions. So we have a number of questions, and I'm going to try and compress them. And I wanted to come to this question two themes, really. One is this question raised by David in the chat of ANC integration into apartheid power, otherwise known as corruption today, which I think is a much broader and deeper question of ANC co-optation into apartheid economic power. And then Spogazi's questions, I'd like to focus on the question of gender, although I do touch on questions of language and religion in the book. Do read it to see how I do that, but I think that's a very important question which we can't leave this conversation without confronting, and I'll touch on that. So in terms of this question of ANC integration into apartheid power, which makes its way into headlines, often about corruption, and to be sure, there are many forms of corruption, but this is the one that I think is most appropriate for the work that we're discussing today. It's very important to notice what happens at the key moment of transition into the first Mandela administration. And in the section on page 95, called Privatizing the ANC, I look at South Africa's first Minister of Finance, Derek Keyes, who was actually brought over from the old order into the new democratic government, a very fascinating figure, who was actually not an NP person. He was an apartheid capital person. He was a big business magnate who had worked with major mining companies, and then was brought on as Minister of Finance in Mandela's administration. And you will not believe the extent of state capture that happened in that period, where Keyes comes from being on the boards of major mining companies into the Ministry of Finance. He changes the rules for capital to be able to flow out of South Africa, and then joins the company that allowed the capital to fly out of South Africa when he resigns from cabinet. So he was not only the beneficiary, he was also the regulator. Now, this process of a revolving door between apartheid capital and the first ANC government did not stop with Derek Keyes. And I'm afraid to say, but I'm going to end on a controversial note, that our current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, represents the apotheosis, the high point of the unity between big capital and big politics, which has become so key, in that we now, in the office of the president, have someone who is both a billionaire and an ANC heavyweight. This is not a mistake. This is the result of a society in which the ANC has become integrated in massive economic power, and massive economic power has become integrated into the ANC. And that's a much more important conversation than just the question of corruption. Then to come on to this question of gender. I presented an early version of this work in 2019, and the work had a chapter on gender, and what I realized the more that I tried to search into apartheid as an ideology, and Professor van der Westhuizen herself, I'm not sure if she's still on the call, I saw she was here earlier, is one of the foremost thinkers on this question. What I saw was that apartheid was not just a racial ideology, that it was only explicit about its racial separations, but in actual fact, it was an ideology of various binaries. And gender was an absolutely central binary of the apartheid project. And it's important to recall that at the formation of South Africa in 1910, women too, including white women, were denied the franchise until 1930, when white women were given the franchise. But even then, the extreme divisions between genders that were engineered through apartheid are absolutely central. And so what I realized is that having a gender chapter actually underplayed the importance of gender engineering in the apartheid project. And so every chapter has a reflection that brings gender into the debate and into the question. Let me just give you a taste and a feel. When I look in the technology chapter at this question, this is on page 108. Gender engineering also underpinned apartheid's classificatory ambitions because of Pretoria's fascination with sexual control, racial purity, and patriarchy. Black women therefore experienced double oppression. White women who enjoyed racial privileges were also oppressed relative to white men because they were viewed as mere vessels of racial purity. For this reason, women's bodies and sexual desires were radically controlled. Consider the regulation of sex. The Immorality Act, first passed in the National Party's first tenure in 1927 and expanded in its second reign, restricted, quote, illicit carnal intercourse between whites and Africans. Under apartheid, it was expanded to apply between white people and all other races. And I look very deeply into that statute and show why it was so central to apartheid ideology, that these inherent racial binaries, but also gender binaries, were interlinked. And indeed, in the new apartheid, we see through crises of various forms of oppression that these binaries have remained and evolved in very dangerous directions, both through forms of patriarchy inside those racialized as Black, and also through forms of racialized gender oppression, which Black men are often oblivious to through their own ignorance, but also the way that apartheid's binaries create this entangled separation that I spoke to earlier. So even from a compromised position as somebody gendered as a man, I could not escape the intense importance of gender in the apartheid project, even though it's often not viewed as purely a gender project because of the emphasis we put on race. But it's clear that in the new apartheid, our failure to scratch the surface of gendered forms of oppression is linked in many deep ways to the understandings of gender which we have unconsciously brought into and have evolved throughout the new apartheid. And I do hope that that aspect of the work comes out more clearly in the conversations. And so I'm glad that you bring it up, and that's why I emphasize it here at the end. So all I can say is that there is much more to this work than I could possibly bring out in this conversation. You will find much more than we have even been able to cover here today. But I do hope that you will engage with it closely, that you will engage with it critically, and that I hope it will lay the basis for much future scholarship, both in the way that it's critiqued, but also in the way that people build off of the theoretical frames that I'm trying to build, and whether this concept of a new apartheid can be a fruitful way of having a multitude of conversations in the academy and in society more generally. And I invite you and I encourage you to use this book in whatever way you see fit in your own research, in trying to drive a new conversation forward past the stale dead ends that we've reached in so many of our other conversations. And that's my hope. I look forward to further engagements on social media. I thank everybody for their time. And I really offer my profound appreciation to CANRAD and NMU and all who've been involved.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Doc. Colleagues, just in the sake of time, I'm going to ask my colleague, Asemahle Kanti, from the international office here at NMU, just to come to the platform and just offer us some closing remarks. Asemahle.
Thank you so much, Sipokazi. Wow, that was a very eye-opening session with very constructive responses and comments as well. First of all, let me start off by saying a good afternoon to everyone that has joined us on a Friday afternoon. As indicated, my name is Asemahle Kanti, and my task is very simple and straightforward as well, which is to provide a word of thanks, firstly to the dedicated team behind the logistics of making today's event possible, from every administrator, assistant, and organizer from the three partners, which you may know, CANRAD, the International Office, as well as the SRC of the Nelson Mandela University. Your work to tie this event together and putting everything together has been amazing, and it does not go unrecognized. And the build-up that has been made in terms of social media, the marketing collateral, that has also been very commendable. If it were not for you, team, this event would have not been possible, especially because it's Friday. I also want to thank Dr. Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh, who is the author of the book, of course, and our keynote speaker today, for such thought-provoking inputs. And I must say that he's probably feeling very tired, because considering the fact that he's been running these sessions for his book launch throughout this week on different universities, launching this eye-opening book. It is definitely not by accident that this book is today the #1 bestseller on every major bookstore in the country. Isn't that amazing? Congratulations, Doc, on this one. Thank you for choosing our university, our Nelson Mandela University, as one of your first stops to launch this timeless book. We really are grateful, and I'm pretty sure that as young people, we've learned something or even more from this session. And I do hope that people are going to go out there and purchase the book if they haven't. Let me also acknowledge my colleague, Mr. Pedro Mzileni, for going through the book and also, most importantly, being available to table a response that stimulated our conversation today. Thank you so much, Mr. Mzileni. I also want to thank our beautiful Sipokazi Dao for steering the conversation all the way through so effortlessly. Thank you so much, Siswam, for your time as well. A job well done. I want to sincerely thank you for your sterling work on this one. And also, most importantly, to each and every one of you who have taken time out of their busy schedule to join us today on a Friday and support this intellectual work. We are grateful, and we hope you will do likewise to other similar initiatives elsewhere. Kuthiwa nangomso siphinde sithi esiXhoseni nenze njalo nakwabanye. Chair, with those words, I want to say thank you. Thank you to everyone for your time. Thank you for your ears. And we really are grateful. Thank you so much. Stay safe and take care.
Thank you so much, Asimahle, and thank you, everyone. Enjoy your weekend.